and we're having this virtual Farbrengen of gathering together Malava Malka this Saturday evening. It's wonderful to have everyone together. To highlight this, we have a very, very special and rare opportunity of having with us Dr. Ira Weiss, who is in Chabad, he is a renowned celebrity. But a little background about Dr. Weiss. Dr. Ira Weiss is a senior attending cardiologist at Evanston Hospital. He's a graduate of Northwestern University Medical School. He had his internship and residency at the Massachusetts General Hospital, his research fellowship at the National Institute of Health at Bethesda, Maryland, and the cardiology fellowship at the Harvard School of Public Health. But here he's our local neighbor at Skokie, and a rare jewel to have in our midst. But within Chabad, he is really a celebrity. Someone who has had a very, very close and rare up-close relationship with the Rebbe and Rebbetzin since 1977. As Dr. Weiss will describe, he was during 1977, during the Hakafos, the Simchas Torah celebration, Dr. Weiss stepped in an unprecedented manner in treating the Rebbe during this very acute situation, and very, very difficult situation, and nursed the Rebbe to a recovery, an unprecedented recovery for the next not only 15 years, but and within those 15 years, the Rebbe he had a very close relationship with the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin, and even afterwards, until the Rebbe had a stroke in 1992, until the Rebbe's passing in 1994. So let me just jump right in, introduce Dr. Ira Weiss, and begin by asking Dr. Weiss, can you please share with us how did you get involved in that situation, being here in Skokie, and being involved with the Rebbe in that situation? Describe to us what that situation was like in 1977.
Thank you, Rabbi Flinkenstein. Shabbat Tov, everybody, and also to Rebbetzin Flinkenstein. I saw her on the screen, and I also might want to acknowledge a lot of old friends that span all my neighborhoods I lived in Chicago. I can cite a couple people just before I answer your question, Rabbi. Roz Conway, Roz Weinberg was my little childhood friend in Logan Square. I had just seen someone who was with me in Edgewater, uptown Edgewater, and then we have some old friends from Sen High School, Joan Silens and her family. And I see Linda Foreman, who's a classmate of mine in Sen. And I see Myron Glassenberg, who was a friend of mine in both the medical field and as a friend and colleague in our neighborhood. And so there's quite a good turnout from old, and I hope I'm not missing anyone whose name I don't catch. I think Judy Gusson I see in the corner there, and Ben Belkin, who's been a friend of ours ever since we've moved from Boston to the Evanston Skokie area. But to tell you this story, it's a little long, but I won't bore you with all the gory details. I'll just say that I had just moved from Boston to Skokie the year before the Rebbe got sick. And we were just going to plan to start my career here with a group of doctors with whom I worked at Evanston Hospital. And I was given a surprise call on the morning of Shmini Atzeret, which is the end of Sukkot, of course, when I got a call from Rabbi Krinsky, who was one of the Rebbe's, the Lubavitch Rebbe's executive secretariats. Now, we had never really met each other, nor had I ever met the Rebbe. But I got an emergency call on my emergency medical phone at about 7 in the morning as I was preparing for synagogue services here. And I was told that the Rebbe was in dire straits. He was going into cardiogenic shock, which is a formal term for a way a person really gets very sick from an extensive heart attack. And this heart attack apparently began the night before, when he was attended by thousands of his Hasidim, as they always do with holidays of that size. And in the confines of 770 Eastern Parkway, which is the Lubavitch world headquarters in Brooklyn. And I heard from Rabbi Krinsky that the issue was that the Rebbe had taken on the heart attack the night before. He was getting progressively sick through the night. He had instructed all the doctors who might have been in attendance there who came to see what was going on. He instructed them on no uncertain terms did he want to leave the 770 for his care. He did not want to go to a hospital, and no one could get out of him why he had this strong position of not wanting to go to a hospital like anyone would ordinarily do when they would have a heart attack of this extent. He was certainly of right mind and consciousness when he made this determination. And his wife, Rebbetzin, whom I will describe to you in greater detail later in my narrative, was really behind 100%. She insisted that my husband is of sound mind, and he really does know what he's talking about. And as you'll hear a little bit from my story, how deeply involved the Rebbe was in knowing science and medicine, that she felt he had every right to make his decision not to leave 770. The problem was that 770 is not a medical care unit, wasn't equipped that way. And the doctors there who pleaded with him to go to the hospital said they can't take the responsibility for his care if he's not going to go to the hospital where he would get supervision, cardiac monitoring, and the things that are done acutely when someone's having an extensive heart attack. So the rabbi progressively got sicker and sicker. His blood pressure sagged to the point that he could no longer converse as this went on through the night. And that prompted Rabbi Krinsky's call to ask me a moral question. He said, "I've not met you, Dr. Weiss, but I know of you." Rabbi Krinsky is the brother of my dear Cheder teacher, Rebbetzin Chava Schusterman, and her husband, Rabbi Herschel Schusterman, who was well known in this community at both my shul, which was a Buddhist Chabad in Edgewater, where I was living as a child, and also later on in Rogers Park at the Bnei Reuven shul. And Rabbi Krinsky said, "But Dr. Weiss, can you help us just make a decision? The Rebbe has become so sick with his heart attack that he's no longer able to converse with us. His pressure is too low to be able to be pleaded with. Can we just take him in this state in an ambulance to a hospital and put him in a decent care unit, coronary care unit, and take care of him?" And I said, "Rabbi Krinsky, I certainly acknowledge that this is the right thing to do, as a normal doctor would say, but you have to take also into consideration that even though I've not met the Rebbe, I have heard such wonderful things about his wisdom. You're going against what he told you and what his wife backs him up on the matter of not leaving 770. And I said, it's certainly the right thing to do medically to move him, of course, the correct thing. But on the other hand, it may be a questionable issue if you can override what the Rebbe told everyone there, that he did not want to go to a hospital. I said, maybe I can propose something to you that might be workable. If you can find the talent right there at 770 of the doctors who have to be on the premises, could some of them do what I've seen done by my own mentors in Boston, which is to take care of often very famous personalities in their own home or in their own private quarter, so as not to be in the public press about an illness, and set up a coronary care unit. In fact, when I was in Boston, my teacher, Dr. Bernard Lown, had set up a special unit on the Baroness de Rothschild's plane as she was being transported for special heart surgery across continents. And as luck would have it, our team was able to resuscitate her on the plane because we were all equipped to take care of her with our own private and not publicized little coronary care unit and bring the Baroness to the surgery that she, which was very successful. I said, I've seen this done. Of course, it takes a lot of resources, but if it's done, you'll have fulfilled the Rebbe's wish to get his care at 770. And at the same time, you'll bring in talent in New York. I'm sure there's plenty of talent in New York who could help bring him, restore him if it is at all possible, if you're not too far gone with the heart attack. And I get off the phone, having given my advice. And a few minutes later, Rabbi Krinsky calls me back and said that, Dr. Weiss, we talked to all the doctors here. No one knows people who have this kind of capability or the resources to bring in equipment so quickly and bring to the Rebbe the private care that you've seen done for famous personalities in our nation's capital, and the Rebbe in Baroness de Rothschild case. We don't have anyone who could do that. Could you be the one who comes in and does this? And I said, oh my gosh, I'm a beginner in my field. I'm only a year out of training. I don't have any resources financially or by connections. I'm not a person who can suddenly leave my practice. I'm going to be losing my job for sure. The people who hired me are a group of non-Jewish, very talented, multi-specialty physicians who brought me in specially to be their cardiologist in their group, and I'm going to have to leave without even notifying them in a great hurry. And even when I get to New York, who do I know there? I don't have medical contacts there or any influence at all, any more than the doctors who live in New York who were at the Farbrengen. I just couldn't, however, leave him stranded like that. And he pleaded with me to come. And I said, Rabbi, it's so hard to imagine how this will work out. I'm leaving my family, which is at that time 2 little daughters, my wife. I'm taking our only car to the airport to find a plane, to find my way to the Crown Heights, which I've never been to before, and then find medical facilities and doctors who can join me. It's not a one-man effort when you do something like this. I said, it just doesn't make any sense, but I couldn't leave him without the willingness to volunteer to help as he had begged of me. And you might ask, how did he know me so well to make a question like this, raise a question like this? Well, years ago, maybe about 4 years before the Rebbe got sick, I had published a cardiology text on heart rhythm analysis. It was at a time when there weren't such things as automatic monitors, and it became a kind of a Bible to the doctors who work in cardiology, who work on making computerized algorithms that would decipher complex cardiac arrhythmias and immediately make determinations of what might be done for a patient who's acutely in a cardiac care unit. So I was kind of known in that way. And because the book took on a certain amount of popularity, I sent a copy of the book to my Cheder teacher, Rabbi Schusterman, just to show him what of his Cheder students in Edgewater Uptown had done. And the rabbi, recognizing that he wasn't going to be reading this book, sent it to Rabbi Krinsky so he could show the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And so the Rebbe took a notice of the book, unknowns to me, and was so interested in the mathematical point of view of the book and in the interesting puzzles that it presented, like some people like to do crossword puzzles, the Rebbe liked to do the thought puzzles of how to decipher these complex arrhythmias. This was the breadth of the Rebbe's interest. So he kept the book in his study on his shelf. His study wasn't very big. It isn't any bigger than this child's bedroom in our house where I'm sitting right now. And among the books that he had in this little study was my book. I did not know that. So they knew of me that way. And I said, I just am taking such a risk on everything, the risk of losing the Rebbe, the certainty of losing my job, the certainty of losing a lot of status among my medical colleagues who said, how could you have ever thought to do such a crazy thing? But I said, I'm obligated because they have no one to help them and they really are stranded here. And I ran to the airport with our only car, parked it in O'Hare, which you know is quite a big airport and quite a big parking lot, not even vaguely remembering what part of the parking lot I put my car in. I ran to American Airlines to their counter and they had a plane leaving in 10 minutes. In those days, you could buy a last minute ticket. But the only problem is before I went to the airport, I had to run to the bank because we didn't have a credit card. It was 1977. Credit cards were available then, but I didn't have one. And we had no cash in the house. So I had to wait for the bank to open at 9 o'clock, get cash to get on the plane, and then come to the airport. And I then arrived at LaGuardia, recognizing that I don't even know where Crown Heights is. So I ran to the cab dispatcher, and he said, sir, we're not dispatching any cabs to Brooklyn right now. They had a murder in the Crown Heights neighborhood within the past week or so, and the racial tensions there are so high that we can't let any of our cabbies go into Crown Heights. What I could suggest for you is to take a bus to the Jackson Heights train station and connect with 2 trains into Brooklyn. And if you're lucky, it'll be about 2.5 hours to get there. And I said, oh my gosh, not only did I make the commitment to come, but I'm not going to in any way be there with any benefit if I come so late. Fortunately, I had thought to call a person who I thought of in the back of my mind who had trained me in Boston. His name was Dr. Louis Tischholz, and a very lovely teacher of mine in the Harvard Medical System, one of my cardiology teachers, a very wonderful man. He had never met the Rebbe. He was a very good-hearted Jew in the fullest way, but he wasn't a Jew who went into deep practice in the aspects of the Torah laws of Judaism. He was one who gave of his heart with everything he did. but he wasn't one who knew about Lubavitch or the Rebbe. He just had heard the name Rebbe. And he volunteered to drop what he was doing. He was the head of cardiology at Mount Sinai Hospital, and he volunteered to go there right away on my call. And I would be there, hours later. I made this call just as I was getting on the plane in Chicago. I made a call. And the interesting thing is, if you ever have made a call to a hospital, I'm sure all of you have had the experience of having to press this button and that button and this thing. In those days, it was just dial phones, but it wasn't buttons. But you never would get right to where you wanted to go, especially to a busy doctor like Dr. Tischholz. But when I called the switchboard operator, and it was a mechanical switchboard, I might add, back in the old days, she heard from the sound in my voice that this was quite an urgent call. And as luck would have it, her switchboard unit for the Mount Sinai Hospital was right down the hall from the cardiology department, and she knew who Dr. Tischholz was. So she got out of her chair and ran down and pulled him by the ear to the phone to talk to me, which was remarkable by itself. So one call got me right to Dr. Tischholz. And Dr. Tischholz, who had never knew the Rebbe, was willing to drop what he was doing to set up a coronary care unit, as he had done with me on some famous personage before in the days we were in Boston. And when I knew that he might be coming, I was relieved, but I wasn't certain. But when I got to the cab station, hearing that there were no cabs, I realized things weren't going to work out as fairy tale as I thought they would be. So I go back into the airport, and even though there were signs posted in the airport, you're not allowed to recruit private rides. If you are, you can be arrested. The person you're dealing with can be arrested. I said, I'm just going to talk to people and ask if anyone's got a private car who could take me to Brooklyn. And no sooner did I run back in the airport than I was stopped by the police for what I thought was the crime I was doing. It turned out the police asked me, are you Dr. Weiss from Chicago? And I said, how would he ever know I'm Dr. Weiss from Chicago? I'm a total unknown. I have no way of showing that I'm Dr. Weiss from Chicago. I don't have a medical bag in my hand even. He said, well, I got a call from Rabbi Krinsky to look for someone in the airport who's wearing a yarmulke, a kippah, because on a day like Yom Tov, no one is going to be traveling with a kippah unless they're on some kind of critical mission on a holiday day like Shmini Atzeret. So they spotted me right away, and they took me right in the police car for an escort into Crown Heights. And we made lightning fast time across Queens and also Brooklyn to get into Crown Heights. And there I saw like a sea of people, most of them wearing dark black coats. It looked like they were coming out of a funeral procession. It was so kind of overpowering. And I didn't know what to do. I remembered on the plane that I had prayed with all my heart and came upon the prayer that we always say in the morning of the Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of the sacrifice of Yitzchak, in which Yitzchak innocently asked his father Avraham, Father, I see the fire, I see the wood, but where's the sacrifice we're going to offer on this mountain, on the Akedat Yitzchak story? And I said, I feel so much like Yitzchak, I just am bewildered. What's going to happen next? Where are we going to even recruit anything? But I prayed with all my heart. And here in the airport was a police escort to take me to Crown Heights. And in Crown Heights were a bunch of people who had to part their ways to create like parting the Red Sea, all these black-coated people separating. The only problem was when I got out of the cabin, was escorted by the police to Crown Heights, to the Rebbe's office at 770. They took a look at me, and I looked kind of like a bar mitzvah. I look pretty old now, I will admit. But in those days, I was 33, and I looked more like a 23-year-old. So I looked like someone who was just 10 years out of his bar mitzvah class. And I'm going to be the big world expert taking care of the Rebbe who's on the verge of not holding together. So there was such a despondency in the crowd, realizing that the big expert from Chicago was nothing more than a kid who looked very, very wet behind the ears. And unfortunately, I know I didn't make much of an impression when I got out. And no sooner did I start walking to the door with the police that a man with a big black kapot, a big black overcoat, jumps over me and smothers me. And I said, oh no, they're probably rejecting me from going in to take care of their Rebbe. So it turned out it was a man named Mr. Koppelbacher from South Africa. And he's telling me, as he's jumping me and hugging me, he said, you're the man who took care of my wife over the phone. She was dying of sepsis, bacterial sepsis, after having given birth to a child in South Africa. and we were advised by someone who knows of you to call you for advice. And I said, I remember the call. We got the call when we were living in Cambridge. And I remember that it involved your wife who was dying of bacterial sepsis after childbirth, but I couldn't reach the doctor who's my infectious disease colleague in South Africa, a fellow named Monty Zion. He was on a safari in Kenya at the time and was not available. I had no one to call upon in South Africa to refer her. But as luck would have it, when I was dating my wife before we got engaged, she lived in a building in Cambridge with a lady named Barbara Zion, who was a PhD student at Harvard, as many of the people in the building were students there. And I said, maybe I talked to Barbara Zion once in the hallway. She had a British accent. Maybe it was a South African accent. I mistook for a British accent. So I called Barbara Zion and she said, I am Monty Zion. I'm his daughter, and he's on a safari in Kenya, but we know how to reach him by shortwave radio in case of an emergency. So back in the day, 4 years before the Rebbe got sick, I reached him through connections through a shortwave radio in Kenya, and he gave instructions to one of his younger trainees of how to take care of this lady and saved Kappelbacher's wife. And I felt so happy that here's a man who came up to me as I'm trying to do Rebbe to remind me of a story that I had long forgotten of how his wife was rescued through an unusual set of circumstances. I said, maybe the circumstances will fall my way as well. When I get to the door, Rebbetzin Schneerson greets me at the door along with Rabbi Krinsky for a meeting for the first time. He said, Dr. Weiss, thank you so much for coming. I want to reassure you that your very dear friend, Dr. Tischholz, arrived 4 hours ago and in an hour restored my husband's blood pressure. He's now conversational and he's stabilizing. So why don't you come upstairs and we'll have Kiddush because it's Yom Tov. I said, Rebbetzin, I came to see your husband. Please let me see the Rebbe first. He said, no, Dr. Weiss, please, we'll make Kiddush first and then you'll see my husband. He's doing very well under Dr. Tischholz's care. So, sort of reluctantly, I went upstairs and made a Kiddush, and I saw this wonderfully divine-looking lady who was the Rebbe's wife, who was so intelligent, and she was so calm and so reassuring, and she was so confident that Dr. Tischholz had done all the right things to get things started. And we made a short Kiddush, after which I gracefully said, thank you, Rebbetzin, and thank you for your blessings. And I went to see the Rebbe, and he was so much as she had described, back to himself. It was just amazing. And there was Dr. Tischholz, who I thanked short but profusely for his amazing rescue. So I just want to correct the story. The one who really saved the Rebbe's life was Dr. Tischholz, not me. I came in to continue Dr. Tischholz's strong footing. So if you want to recite the story to anybody, you say Dr. Tischholz, you don't say Dr. Weiss. But we had such a warm reunion, the two of us. Dr. Tischholz and I had not seen each other for several years, but we got things set up to make a real solid coronary care unit. And it was more than you can imagine. In a hospital in those days, if you were a patient in the hospital and were a heart patient, you'd be wired up to the wazoo with all kinds of wires that go to the monitors. And you would be stuck in bed because of all these wires. If you had to go to the washroom, it's a problem because you're all so wired up, you can hardly move from the bed to the, and if you go, people are gonna have to escort to the washroom, you're not even private. Everything but dignity was applied in the days when we just had wired monitoring. But Dr. Tischholz, who was the director of the technology for the space program, was the one who developed the telemonitors that were being used for space cadets who were going in outer space. And he was able to get them to bring it from their facility on the New Jersey Turnpike immediately to Crown Heights. So we had the Rebbe not heavily wired. The Rebbe was in a kapota. He had his coat on. He had his wires, and he was sitting there talking with us. More amazingly than the technology and the simplicity of the monitoring was the fact that the Rebbe asked us exactly what happened. So we sat down and explained that the heart attack involved the loss of a certain amount of heart muscle, in his case, probably a significant amount of heart muscle, based on what we saw in the cardiogram, and based on what we saw about his weak cardiac performance initially with very low blood pressures. And we explained that part of the heart is not contracting, and part of the heart, the remaining part, is doing all the work. And the Rebbe immediately, as a trained mechanical engineer in his younger days at the Sorbonne, started to think, well, what do you do about the part of the heart that's not contracting? How do you make it come back? I said, Rebbe, I'm sorry to tell you that when the heart is damaged that way, it loses its vitality usually forever. And we just have to accept that it's going to be a non-contracting part of the heart against which the rest of the heart does all the contraction. And the Rebbe was not fully satisfied with how we were thinking this out. He said, do you gentlemen ever rely on stem cell research? And we heard the word stem cell research, but it was a very new term. And it was being applied to some ideas of how to bring certain fundamental cells into certain levels of differentiation into more complicated cells. But it had not been applied yet to heart muscle, and it was not a widespread technology. Only 10 years later, after our encounter with Rebbe, was the first attempt made to bring fibrous tissue into muscle cell by a researcher out of our domain. But this was 10 years ahead of its first fundamental start. And now, even nearly 40 years, more than 40 years later, it's now becoming potentially a reality, but it certainly was way ahead of its time. And I asked Rebbe Krinsky, how did the Rebbe even think of stem cells? Well, the Rebbe tells me, well, he reads the journal Nature and the proceedings of the National Academy of Science. I said, he does? Does he have any time for his own studies? He said he loves to read about things to know what's going on in the field of science. I was amazed. And then we described the fact that, the heart was going to be pumping with one side only. And the Rebbe immediately thought of a brilliant idea. He said, Dr. Weiss, if you're relying on just part of my heart, half my heart pumping and the other part just standing by, you want to make the work for this part of the heart as easy as possible. You should make the chamber size as small as possible. Because he said when he was a child, in his childhood, he used to watch soap bubbles and he would blow air into the bubble until it became stretched to a point when the wall tension was great enough to pop the bubble. He said the larger the chamber in physics, the higher, the harder it would be for the muscles to contract against such a high level of wall stretch pressure. He said, we have to keep the heart as small as possible. I said, Rebbe, that's really a fundamental idea in cardiology, that if we keep your salt intake low, so you don't retain a lot of fluid and stretch out your heart, you keep the heart nice and small and allow the muscles who have to do all the work to have a slightly easier job. It's kind of like giving a person you're hiring in your store a lighter job if he had a recent arm injury than if he had a nice strong arm. And it was certainly a brilliant strategy. It's well worked out in cardiology that that's a fundamental way of treating patients who've had a significant amount of heart damage. And the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin got together on our suggestion to start working out a different way of eating. The Rebbe loved salt. He always had food that required koshering, and they switched to a diet that was kosher but not requiring koshering. Like they would eat fish instead of kosher meat or kosher chicken. They would change the recipes for soup to be nearly sodium free. And I'll tell you, that thinking on day 1 or 2 of his heart attack made all the difference in the world for how his heart performed in the 15 subsequent years in which he was very, very physically active. And we got together a team. We had my teacher from Boston, Bernard Lown, was brought in by the State Department from China because they recognized how critical the Rebbe was for affairs of our United States. The Rebbe had his finger on all kinds of things going on in all kinds of countries, especially the Soviet Union. So they wanted him to be alive for strategic reasons for the United States. And he was on a research mission in China. They flew him right in to join us, to give us his expert advice, which was very appreciated. And that was done all in one day. They got him flown in from China right away to help us. And a dear colleague of mine from my high school years, Mike Resnick, was a chief physician in Hawaii for the Army. He was serving his 2-year military as the chief medical officer of the Hawaii medical base for the Army. And the Army brought him in because they also knew the Rebbe's strategic value to the United States. So he was brought in and switched to head the Army hospital in Staten Island so he could be on hand to be the Rebbe's regular doctor, even when I finished my tour of duty on the initial stabilization of the Rebbe. So I got a chance to meet Larry, and I might tell you that Larry and I, when we were in Cheder together, we would go to shul on Shabbos, all right, but when it came to Torah reading, we were both bored silly, so we would go outside, punch and slug each other in the hallway, as kids would want to do when they're little kids. So my old punching bag buddy was there to help me, so it was an amazing coincidence. And we had some other doctors, a neighborhood doctor, Dr. Bob Feldman was involved. He was a very devoted, hardworking internist who worked in the neighborhood. He was always on hand, and a couple of other doctors who came and helped as well. So we had about a 5-man team. Now, we structured our care a little differently from the hospital, making me increasingly realize why the Rebbe insisted on having care at 770 rather than in a hospital. Not only did he get Dr. Lou Tischholz's expertise in the telemonitoring, which was way beyond its time for bringing patients into dignity and comfort in a hospital, but also we structured a team where we took shifts of 4 hours, which meant we weren't going to get exhausted. I remember my days at the Mass General, we were contracted to work 24, it was 36 hours out of every 48 was our contract work time. And we actually worked, it was very hard work because there was a very top-notch hospital. And we were always so exhausted. I was always like haupt verschliffen, as they say, because I was so exhausted from the terrible hours and the terrible pressure on the doctors then when we would do our own lab tests and a lot of other things all by ourselves. So we developed a system where we had 4-hour shifts. I would be there all the time because I was sort of like the supervisor of this. But the 4-hour man was the nurse, the pharmacist, the vital signs taker, the charter, and of course the examiner of the patient. So there wasn't communication errors unless we had a person who would forget from 1 minute to the next what he's doing. We would have a flawlessly solid set of care for the 4 hours. And then with a half-hour transfer time, there'd be the next man for 4 hours, next. And I basically slept in the room there just to be on hand in case someone had an immediate question. But it was a very effective way of getting him out of trouble. It's not been rivaled in any hospital I've been because all I know is when I've worked as a doctor, and I think that anyone here who's a physician, like the couple of people I cited when I said hello earlier, that they have had experiences where communication errors, kind of delayed the proper care or distorted the proper care at times. This is inevitable, just normal human error. Or the fact is that people were too exhausted to continue on and on and on and on and on and get more calls and more calls and more crises. We just limited it to 4-hour shifts, and you had a 4-hour shift once a day. That you were worked like a dog for 4 hours, and the rest of the time was yours. So it was a very, very effective way of care because of communication protection and also exhaustion protection. Now, this worked out very well. I didn't stay forever. I was just there for the first 2 weeks. And then I made regular trips back practically every month to see how the Rebbe was doing and also help straighten out any little shifts in how the Rebbe was doing. But in the course of the years that followed, I couldn't get over how the Rebbe had returned back to his normal vitality. And as you probably, if you read the story of the Rebbe's work, you'll see from the time of his heart attack in 1977 through the time when he suffered a bad stroke in 1992, those were 15 years of his great productivity with a special focus on developing the worldwide program of Lubavitch so that it was really shluchim in every corner of the earth, every corner of the globe. And it was an amazing outcome that would have not been possible. The Rebbe succumbed to the heart attack, God forbid, or had he been given normal management of a heart attack without the restoration of his vitality, this could not have happened. So a lot of the people who come for Kinas HaShluchim always recognize that they were put on this planet because the Rebbe was vital enough to have the foresight of where to send them and how to encourage them to go further as a direct result of having made not just the recovery to survive a heart attack, but also recovery functionally at a very high level, a level comparable to his level before the heart attack. And this is something that one could not have possibly predicted. We even amongst ourselves as doctors couldn't help but say amongst ourselves in privacy that this kind of heart attack doesn't work out for anybody. I mean, if you're lucky if you can survive it, you're even luckier if you can be functional, but not at any high level. But this exceeded our wildest expectations. It was something that we couldn't possibly have logically predicted as an outcome from what we saw. And we were so graced. In fact, all my prayers on the airplane when I was davening with all my heart that the Akeda story would come true for me too, that something amazing would come up to switch the story. And it did switch. In the course of the years, I had a lot of contact with Rebbetzin Schneerson. I would make a daily call to her every night. And it was very late for her. I would call at 10 o'clock when I finally schlepped home from the hospital. And for her, it would be 11 o'clock. She'd be waiting for the call. But she would not only be waiting for the call, she'd be prepared for the call. She would know the Cubs score and the ballpark because she knew I loved the Cubs. And she confided in me the Rebbe loved the Brooklyn Dodgers. And I confided in her I loved them too, till they left for California in 1957 or 58. And she would always know the weather in Chicago. And I said, Rebbetzin, why are you so interested in the weather? She said, I heard, Dr. Weiss, from your wife that you bicycle to work all the time. I said, it's true, Rebbetzin, but uh, I always made it so I lived within 4, 5, or 6 miles of where I work, so it's not that long a ride. But she was tracking me almost like a surrogate mother of sorts. But more than that, she was someone who I could see was always very involved with what was going on in the world news. She sometimes made a couple of comments about it. And she also had at her home, at the Rebbe's home on President Street, she would have a circle of friends who would meet once a week. And they were a very intellectual group. They spoke many languages. I certainly detected German, and I certainly detected French, I certainly detected Russian, and a few other languages I was not capable of detecting. And they were speaking to each other. They were multilingualists, all of them, as the Rebbe was himself. And the books in the little book area, the magazine area, were world magazines that people who know European politics are reading, or British politics, or the very intellectual magazines. And she also had a great interest in science. She would go once a week. She would drive herself to the New York Public Library and start studying books in biological science. I was advised that she was one of the contributors to a little book called Talks and Tales, which I read throughout childhood. And there was a section that Nissen Mendel, the editor, wrote called In Nature's Corner. And the Rebbetzin would give him material for the lessons you could learn from watching the bees cooperate in a beehive, or the methods by which animals do communicate to each other, even though we've not been capable of communicating. And I even found out, from the Rebbetzin, that if you're bicycling home, if you're going home at any point when the sun's rising or sun's down, you'll hear how much the birds are talking to each other. And I became amazed at how the birds, Rebbetzin, as we say in Yiddish, talk things over at the end of the day, and they talk things over at the beginning of the day. And the rest of the day, they're nice and quiet, just doing their errands and catching worms or whatever, they're building nests. But I actually had a lot of enjoyable communication. She also was a very gracious lady. She dressed with such tasteful style. She bought her clothes at Bonwit Teller. That was her favorite store. If you remember, we had a Bonwit Teller here in Chicago in the North Michigan Avenue section. And I always noticed Bonwit Teller had an unusual clientele. They were a step above the other clientele. So that was her store in New York. And she would do all the driving herself. She was, up in years, and she had no problem navigating New York traffic, finding a parking space or a parking lot, or whatever she did, always by herself. But she was an independent lady who was really apart from the crowd, you might say. And the Rebbe and Rebbetzin were really a really strong couple. They would play little tricks on each other. They would take April Fool's Day very seriously, and there would always be some kind of trick on April Fool's Day. And it was close to the time of the Rebbe's birthday, so there were always little tricks added. One time we had our 2 little daughters. We have 3 daughters altogether, but the 2 that were our first 2 daughters. So we come in there, we're sitting there on the couch talking to the Rebbe's, and my wife and I, and my oldest daughter was polite enough to sit with us. The other one runs off in this big home, and suddenly you hear breakage and clatter, and it's like, oh no, she went to the china cabinet, and of course she did, and of course she broke some things. But the Rebbetzin was cool as a cucumber. She said, and she even gave little Becky a special Hanukkah gelt that year, because she loved the little one who broke all the things in her cabinet. But she was just as calm as a cucumber about things like that. She just was a graceful and tasteful and very smart lady. She had trained in architecture at Sorbonne when the Rebbe was trained in mechanical engineering. So she was actually, she didn't develop as a professional architect in her work. She was actually the Rebbe's wife and the Rebbetzin of Chabad. We also, over the years, had a lot of chance to have unusual stories. I'll just tell you a very interesting story. Since this is a Chicago-based crowd, this will make some sense to you. So I went to Senn High School, and we have a couple Senn graduates here with us tonight who I really appreciate loyalty, and I acknowledged some of them earlier. So my second reunion was in 1981. I graduated with a class of 61, and I wouldn't be one to miss a reunion. And I told the Rebbe about it, and he was very happy that I was a person who loved my high school. I said I loved many of my classmates. I had wonderful classmates there, wonderful teachers. He was very happy, even though he knew it was a secular school. It wasn't a Jewish-oriented school. It was a regular secular school, but a nice student body, many of whom were very, very nice friends, nice people to know. And he was all happy I was going to the reunion. I think he had in the back of his mind, that I would go and influence a few people to think about Chabad when I would go there. I wasn't quite that kind of a Chabadnik, I must admit, but I was looking forward just for social contact with all my friends there. And as we were going into the weekend when the reunion was to be held, I got a call from one of the Rebbe's executive secretariat that the Rebbetzin was no longer feeling well. She was not able to concentrate on the newspaper. And of course, all her being was reading and learning and reading and learning and being in contact with the newspapers. And she was too weak to even pick up the paper. And she was running a low-grade fever. And it didn't sound right to me. And I remember back to the time when I first took her to the Rebbe. This was 1977 when I first met the Rebbe in Rebbetzin. The rabbi said, you know, you and Dr. Tischoltz and Dr. Laun have spent so much time with me. You didn't spend any time with my wife. Even maybe she never goes to the doctor. Maybe you should listen to her heart. So of course I obliged the Rebbe and listened to the heart and heard a little murmur over one of her valves, the aortic valve, which I said it's a very trivial murmur, but it's over the aortic valve area, and we'll just keep it in mind. But when I heard about this illness with this fever and her languish state, her not being herself, I said, could it be that there's something, infected that's causing such a change? So I had Dr. Feldman, the local doctor, come and describe her physical findings to me, and she had little marks under her fingernails. And I said, the more I'm hearing this, the more I'm hearing that this might be a heart valve infection of this aortic valve, which the Rebbe prophetically had me listen to in 1977. I said, I don't want to take the chance of going to the reunion and not taking care of this promptly. So I called and I said to the secretary, please tell the Rebbe that I'm going to come in this weekend to see the Rebbetzin. And the Rebbe replied, but Dr. Weiss, tell Dr. Weiss he has a reunion to go to at his high school. And I said, this overrides the reunion. And the Rebbe said, if he'll come in, tell Dr. Weiss to come in after the reunion's over. I said, that won't be until Sunday or Monday, more like Monday. I said, that's waiting too many days on something that could involve a lot of loss of things. She could be spraying things off her aortic valve into her brain or who knows where. And it was already getting to be Shabbos, and I was told not to come in by the Rebbe. Now, if you ask Rabbi Flinkenstein what he would have done, he would have said, I would have listened to the Rebbe. He's my Rebbe. And I said, but he's my Rebbe too, but I think I would tell you that I can't let the Rebbe's opinion override my medical opinion in this case. I know that's a little chutzpahdik, but it was my determination that the Rebbe is asking me to come in too late for his wife. So I hop over to the airport, get over on the plane, and we come in, it's already Shabbos when I get there. But in those days, they didn't have electronic turnstiles on all these buses and trains. I just was able to ask the nice people in the transit authority of the MTA in Boston, in New York. They all let me on the bus to the train, and the train got me in. So by 9:30, 10 o'clock, I was in Crown Heights without having done more than just walk through turnstiles that they let me go through. It was like riding like a Shabbos elevator that's horizontal. I didn't press any buttons or nothing. The doors weren't automatic or electronic in those days. So I said, I don't really think I did anything the Rebbe would be discouraged by. And I walked over to their house. It was about 9:30, 10 o'clock. And I figured they're probably all asleep. It's Shabbos. It's, the summer, but it's, they might have gone to sleep already. I knock on the door, and the door immediately swings open. I said, gee, I was expecting it to knock about 15 times for them to hear me. And Baruch Halberstam, Chesed Halberstam was at the door as the steward of the house to let me in. And he introduces me to the Rebbe, who's sitting in the parlor in his full kapote, beautifully dressed for Shabbos, sitting there. He said, Chesed said, the Rebbe is sitting here waiting for you. So the Rebbe already knew that I would override his opinion. It's the way the Rebbe worked. He knew I would, and not only was he sitting there, knowing that I was going to come in, he was sitting with 4 little Sidurim. They were the newly translated Sidurim, because the Rebbe asked me once what I could have done for me special to acknowledge that I helped him. And I said, I would love to have a translation of the Siddur that I've used since childhood. The Tehillas Hashem Siddur was translated in 1978. by Nissim Mangel beautifully. And I began to understand the prayers and learned a lot more Hebrew by just taking the time to read the prayers with the English translation and recognizing what a phenomenal translation it was. But these were miniaturized versions. He got one for Myra, my wife, and my two older daughters. The little one wasn't yet born. It was 1981. And they were gifts that I was to take back when I was through with the mission on that weekend. I go upstairs to see the Rebbetzin, and it didn't take much medical examination to recognize she probably did have heart valve infection known as endocarditis. And this was going to be a disaster if it wasn't intercepted properly. And we got right to work to treating her, and Dr. Bob Feldman may be credited for spending all his time going, I think it was 4 times a day into her tiny little veins, putting little catheters. And we didn't put these indwelling catheters like they put in, which always get infected. We just put little steel needles in, so it would be no chance of infection. But she was so daintily built that it was a project to get each one of these needles to work. But we gave her 6 weeks of therapy, which did resolve the problem completely. And the Rebbe and Rebbetzin asked me, "What about your reunion, Dr. Weiss?" That was their concern. What about your reunion? I said, I missed it, but I'm going to, I'll look. They put together a little book of all people's accomplishments. It's maybe a, couple 100-page book. Those people put back a little story about themselves, put a page in. And the Rebbe called me over. He said, "Dr. Weiss, I want you to do this for me as a friend. I want you to read every one of those pages in detail and take note of what you're reading." I said, "Rebbe, normally I would read about half them because I didn't know everybody in the class. I wasn't, in all the clubs and all the societies and all the activities at school." But he said, even if you only were going to read half of them, I want you as a friend, as he said it, to read every page. And I took him seriously. Of course, I would follow those kind of recommendations. I read every page. And there was a classmate of ours named Doreen, who I didn't know personally. She was a lovely girl in the class, but someone I didn't have that much social contact with. And she was describing her husband who had a problem with kidney failure and how they researched to find the best place in the world, which at that time was the University of Minnesota, to have a transplant, and how he was thriving and returning back to his work and his pursuits, and how thankful she was. And I said, what a beautiful thing that Doreen wrote about her husband, her poor husband. And then I thought that I live on a little street here in Skokie, Sleeping Bear Road. I said, down the street is a couple. It's a doctor and his wife, and the wife is having kidney failure, and she's not succeeding on dialysis. And they're a little, hesitant about moving forward on this. It's a new field, kidney transplant in 1981. I said, I'm going to connect them with Doreen and her husband. Even though they never met each other, I'm going to bring them together. And so I made the shidduch. They joined forces, and they became very good friends. All 4 of these people, Doreen, her husband, and our dear neighbors. And they gave them much psychological encouragement to go forward. And of course, the doctor of our neighbor, who's a doctor, is a pediatric nephrologist. He's a pediatric kidney specialist. So he was very much able to, go to University of Minnesota, get the best medical team to do the best things for his wife. And Baruch Hashem, this is 1981. Baruch Hashem, his wife is still our neighbor down the street. She's still, thank God, very much alive and well with the one transplant she got from a non-relative. It couldn't have been more fairy tale like. It's, I think, one of the longest runs of a kidney transplant. And to mention her as being functional is an understatement. She's a wonderful lady. And this was fostered by this unusual story I told you of how the Rebbe and Rebbetzin work. And you might say, it sounds like a fairy tale, but it's 100% truth. And unfortunately, Doreen, my high school classmate, her husband ran a long course, but in recent years, he passed away. I saw Doreen maybe 4 or 5 years ago. He had passed away. But I can't tell you enough how critical it was. I would never have read Doreen's page in that book from the reunion, because I just wasn't, she wasn't like my mishpacha group at Sen High School. But it just gives you an example of how this worked. I'm sorry to take up so much of your time. I wanted to tell you this little story to show you how the Rebbe works, how the Rebbetzin works, but I would more prefer to hear your own questions about how this all works or what the Rebbe was like or some particular details, because all I can say is that I can't be thankful enough to God for what he did to pull us through. It is true that when I came back from the mission, it is true that my colleagues politely, disengaged me from their group. There was no controversy, there was no legal battle, or it was clear and simple. They had the right to do this. I was content with it. And it turned out that even though I'm not much of an organizer, I had to figure out how to set up my own medical practice. And it worked out better for me. I was able to do medicine my own way. My rule in medicine was not everyone else's rule. I did not prefer to send people bills or have a billing secretary doing that. I just simply did what we could do to put a bill through, an honest, straightforward bill to insurance, and accepted whatever was done. If there was a co-pay, we canceled it. It was a deductible, we canceled it. And we never charged anyone who had no insurance at all. And I couldn't have done that in a partnership with other doctors who had to keep the office open. I just kept my overhead low and the office was simple and straight. And I like to do it that way. And I'm actually proud of the fact that the medical practice was run without having people feeling that they would go bankrupt seeing me or stuff like that. And I'll tell you, it came as a result of having to make that switch from the group practice, which would have not worked that way. They would have been very strong about getting the payment on the table. And I liked very much having the independence of being able to give medical care that basically expressed my thanks for the privilege of learning the medical field, having the privilege of learning medical science and having wonderful teachers, and having the privilege of trying to help people. And I never went broke. We just, we lived on a simple scale, which was all I needed anyway in life. And I liked it that way. But I would want to open the floor to the people here who might have a few questions, and my dear old friends can say hello too. I really appreciate all your coming to me as a matter of interest and, of course, loyalty to an old friend.
Well, that was amazing, Dr. Weiss. Truly, truly amazing. And thank you for sharing all that. First of all, I would like to go back to what you mentioned about being the hero of during that period of time. Without, excuse me for saying, but without your involvement, I don't know if Dr. Tischholz would have been involved at all. So I'm throwing you back into the heroic state that you have. And on top of that, being so dedicated, incredibly dedicated, we are forever indebted to you for giving us the Rebbe for all these years. There's nothing we can do to thank you enough for that.
Thank you, Rabbi. I don't think you're that much of a hero, but
and the kind of practice that you do is similar to how the Rebbe conducted himself. It's just amazing. But I'd like to open the floor. Anyone who would like to have any questions, please private chat me. Be able to ask Dr. Weiss. In the meantime, if I can ask you, Dr. Weiss, you've had interactions with many other personalities and leaders, and from someone being quote unquote, I hate to say outside, but you're not outside. You were someone who had the cheder interaction and being with Rebbetzin Schusterman, but having for the first time an interaction within the inner Hasidic and Chabad community, especially for those who had a veneration towards the Rebbe. What was your interaction like? How did you then describe it being so up close?
Well, I'm kind of a shy person by real nature. Maybe people won't say that, but I am very shy. And once the Rebbetzin and Rebbe had me come over to have supper with them, Chesed Halberstam, there's 4 people in the room. Chesed Halberstam, the steward in the house, the Rebbetzin, Rebbe, and me. And I'll tell you, I felt I was way out of my league. And I just wish I could have crumbled and become a fly on the wall. I was always when I was in the Rebbe's presence, Rabbi, I can be much more comfortable sitting with you and your friends here from Chabad. But with the Rebbe, I was always very nervous. So I really couldn't go into great discussions. My medical colleagues had more of a sense of themselves, and they could talk with the Rebbe about things. I know Dr. Lown, for sure, my teacher, they would get into heavy talks, arguments. I could never go that far. So the best I could do, I think when I was being asked to give a report on the Rebbe early in the illness, day 2 of the Rebbe's illness, they had me come out to give a little talk about the Rebbe, and I couldn't talk about his medical problems. He couldn't divulge all the dangerous status. It was a delicate tight wire to walk, because if you told them that the Rebbe was so badly injured, nobody would want to use him as a Rebbe because they wouldn't want to hurt him, torture him with their questions. On the other hand, if you did too little, you wouldn't be in contact with the Rebbe. But they asked me to give them a niggun, a song that would give them a spirit at the time they were hearing the report that he had had a heart attack. And I didn't know any of the niggun that they were looking for. But as luck would have it, Myra, who was a teacher at Wellesley College for many years, had a student who invited us once over for tea in the afternoon at their house. And they had a TV on, they had PBS, public broadcasting system on, and they had a series called Religions of the World. And that particular moment we were sitting down and she turned on the TV was Lubavitch, and there was Label Bertritsky opening up mincha for his neighbors in the Lower East Side, and I was hearing the Rebbe sing Oshiat Amecha and singing that with a whole vitality that vibrating. If you look at any movies, for those who haven't had the privilege of seeing these, you can see them probably through YouTube and Gem and see how the Rebbe conducted himself with such vigor. And I said, I saw this on TV. I can do something right now. While they're asking me to give a niggun, I don't know what niggun, but I'll say, Oshiat Amecha. And I did what the Rebbe did, pounding my thing. And I immediately made immediate connection with Chabad in such a way, because they said, he's one of us. That was a critical moment. Seeing that TV show years ago in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and translating it to an actual imitation of the Rebbe and the full vigor of the song, which the words are easy to remember, made me connect. And from that point, I would be invited to people's sukkahs. I know the Raskin family with a fish store. I was like one of the people who had to be there to do all the big dancing and singing. And I think that's what brought me in. It wasn't through my being so very personable, but I became someone who was like a friend to the community in a way that was very peculiar. And people still remember our great times when we would dance in the sukkahs all through Crown Heights and all that. And I think the brotherhood was established that way. I never became a big chassid. I always had attachment to the Rebbe. I always davened with the same siddur I had since childhood, Tihiras Hashem, and took everything quite seriously. But I think the connection, the human connection that made me a friend of the community, a friend of the family, as they say, was things that had nothing to do with my medical skills or my attending the Rebbe.
All right, thank you, thank you. Anyone has any questions? All right, no one has any questions yet. Feel free to unmute yourself. But if you can share something about the unique, from your interactions and what you've observed between the Rebbe and Rebbetzin, knowing that the Rebbe had such late hours, sometimes coming home when there were private audiences, coming home 4 or 5 in the morning, and then whenever the Rebbe had a quote unquote light day, the Rebbe would come home at 10, 11 o'clock at night, having continuous interaction and time with the Rebbetzin. Can you share anything about that you may have been privy to?
Well, I'll tell you, I learned a lot about that connection when the Rebbe was released from his little homemade CCU that we made for him in his study at 770. It was on Rosh Chodesh Kislev, the beginning, the first of the month of the Jewish month Kislev, going into the holiday like Hanukkah. So we were so happy that he was qualified to leave the premises and go back to his private domain, which was his home, and we were asking the Rebbe, how do you feel? He said he feels very, very good. He thinks he made a substantial recovery. He recognizes increased strength, and he even walked part of the way home that day. And we asked him, what does he feel most happy about? He said, I feel happiest to be reunited with my wife, because we always have had the custom of having a private moment around 4 in the afternoon for tea. It's probably a European custom to have tea. I don't take time off for tea at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, or for that matter, any other time, because the day goes by. But he always made a little time to be with his wife in privacy. And he said having that private moment with his wife was the critical thing that he felt most happy about. And he really, you could see in his eyes and in his heart was expressed of how important the Rebbetzin was to him. And the Rebbetzin felt that way about her man, her husband. And this became evident in how she talked about him at a deposition she had to give in Brooklyn Federal Court about a matter of the Chabad Library. It became clear to me and how she talked about her husband on a daily basis when I made the phone calls. It was an important lesson for all of Chabad to hear, to know how important it is to be a good husband, a good wife, and have, even as bad as the day is and as busy as it is, to have a little moment of privacy, to have the time to talk together on your own, in your own private domain, and be connected in a very important spiritual way. And it was really heartwarming to hear him say that, and very meaningful. Something that I would wish could be broadcast widely to Chabad. When you take on marriage, this is part of the important sacred duty of marriage, being a close friend of your spouse.
Wow, that's incredibly special. Thank you. Anyone has any questions? Just limited time for questions. Feel free to unmute yourself. We'll just have, if anyone has any questions to ask.
Oh, I see someone's hand go up. Joel? Joel Klein?
Hi. During the treatment of his MI, would there be daily blood tests, cardiac enzymes, and
Sure.
lactate? And
We had all these measurements, and we actually had immediate contact with the laboratory at Brooklyn Hospital. At I think it's called Brooklyn Hospital, a nearby hospital. It was very cooperative. And at times when I needed special tests, I would run them myself. Like when the Rebbetzin had her blood cultures taken for this heart diagnosis I mentioned in the long-winded story I gave, that actually I took them in myself because I didn't want anyone to tell me it wasn't brought to the right lab. They weren't instructed properly of how to culture these things, because so much was at stake by doing it right. And we had very good medical support. Anytime we needed equipment, people were more than happy to help us. The laboratory tests were always readily available. It was as formally done as would be done in a hospital. Joel, is that what you're asking? We didn't cut corners on the formality of establishing diagnoses or doing tests. I ran into an interesting problem. I'm licensed in Massachusetts and in Illinois. So I was once called to give a testimony to protect the Rebbe from deposition that was being asked of him in regard to a matter of the Chabad Library. And we had recognized, Dr. Larry Resnick and I recognized how serious a matter it would be to stress the Rebbe like this, to be in court. And I was told by my father, who was not even privileged to have a formal education, he was just in a very poor childhood and in an underprivileged situation. But he had the wisdom to tell me, he said, Ira, you're going in there without a license to practice in New York. Shouldn't you be aware of what your limitations are? So my father had encouraged me to go downtown to the Northwestern University Law Library to study the New York law books on what are the privileges for an out-of-state doctor. And there I learned something, that you could be a consultant, but you have to be invited to write your notes, and you can't do any procedures unless you were especially, for the moment, given a privilege to do that. I was called before Judge Sifton in the Brooklyn Federal Court to protect the Rebbe against having to give a deposition. And I knew to protect him, not because I was making up a story that he shouldn't go to the deposition. I had seen him have very serious arrhythmias when he was giving one of his early Farbrengens. We had telemonitoring secretly positioned under the benches while we were sitting at his first Farbrengen. We saw life-threatening arrhythmias occur when he was getting to some very emphatic points. And I said, he just can't be pushed by a judge into the corner of something stressful question that could perhaps cause him to drop dead, God forbid. So the judge had me come up, and the opposing parties grilled me. He said, Dr. Weiss, can you tell us your education? And I mentioned where I went to school and all this. Can you tell us your licensure? I said, I'm licensed in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the state of Illinois. Can you tell us, Dr. Weiss, are you licensed to practice medicine in the state of New York? Because had I admitted that I wasn't, I would be called on the carpet for having done something that was really subject to vicious penalties and ostracization, perhaps even loss of medical license. And I said, Your Honor, I said to the opposing lawyer, I said, I will open for you a little page I once copied from the New York law books. I read verbatim what the rules are, and I said I've abided by these rules, and the whole court broke into laughter because it made the other lawyer look so silly, and we immediately won the release of the Rebbe from the deposition because of my father's wisdom, his blue collar wisdom, as I call it, to know not to be in any way transgressing the laws of New York, and it was amazing. But we were pretty much at the formal hospital. It wasn't chartered. We had, of course, Professor Lown, who was a Nobel laureate. We had Professor Tischholz, and I was a younger member of the team, but we had some pretty heavyweight people on the team.
Thank you again, Dr. Weiss. We are incredibly grateful, and to you and to your dear wife Myra, because she deserves the credit all the way for allowing you to be able to make all these visits and to spend all this time. And we all wish you together that Hashem should bless you with many, many long years, as the Rebbetzin had 120 to 180. And you should have much nachas from your children and kind of her grandchildren. And thank you for sharing this very precious time and sharing these interactions that you have with the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin. And we should all have a Shavua Tov, a good Vach. Thank you again, and God bless you.
Amen.
I'm going to take all my
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
So clear and Arthur.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to thank all my friends who are loyal enough to my group. I'm just flattered to have a little local following who I love